Welcome, viewers, to a journey through one of history's most violent and unforgiving chapters. Before we begin, I'm curious. What time is it where you're watching? Are you settling in for the evening somewhere in North America, perhaps catching this during your lunch break in Europe, or maybe it's already tomorrow where you are in Asia or Australia? Wherever you are, whatever time it is, you're about to witness something that will fundamentally change how you think about medieval life, suffering, and human endurance. Picture this. You're a peasant farmer in 12th century France. You've never traveled more than 10 miles from your birthplace. You can't read, you've never seen a map, and your entire worldview consists of your village, the local lord's castle, and the church where you pray every Sunday. Then one day, men arrive with crosses sewn onto their clothing, speaking of holy war in a distant land you've never heard of. They promise you salvation, forgiveness of all sins, and eternal paradise if you take up arms for God. Within months, you're trudging across 1,000 miles of hostile territory, watching your companions die of disease, starvation, and violence, all for a cause you barely understand in a land that exists only in your nightmares. This wasn't fiction. This was the reality for hundreds of thousands of people during the Crusades, a series of religious wars that lasted for nearly 2 centuries and left an indelible mark of brutality on medieval Europe and the Middle East. What you're about to hear isn't just another history lesson about battles and dates. This is the untold story of human suffering on an almost incomprehensible scale, where life was cheaper than a loaf of bread and death lurked around every corner. The Crusades began in 1095, when Pope Urban II delivered what would become one of history's most consequential speeches at the Council of Clermont. But to understand why his words ignited such a firestorm of violence, we need to understand just how brutal and desperate life already was in medieval Europe. This wasn't a time of chivalrous knights and romantic quests. This was an era where the average person lived in conditions that would horrify us today, where violence was the primary means of resolving disputes, and where the line between civilization and barbarism was razor thin. Medieval Europe in the 11th century was a continent in constant turmoil. The collapse of the Carolingian Empire had left a power vacuum filled by countless petty lords who ruled through force and intimidation. These weren't noble rulers guided by high ideals. They were essentially warlords who had carved out territories through violence and maintained control through fear. The feudal system that dominated Europe was built on a foundation of brutality that extended from the highest nobleman to the lowest serf. Consider the life of a typical peasant in this era. You would wake before dawn in a one-room hovel shared with your entire family, possibly including your animals for warmth. The walls were made of mud and straw, the floor was packed dirt, and there were no windows because glass was a luxury beyond imagination. Your breakfast, if you were fortunate enough to have one, consisted of thin gruel made from whatever grain you could afford, often mixed with sawdust or ground acorns to stretch it further. Your day would be spent in backbreaking, labor in the fields, using tools that hadn't changed significantly since Roman times. You worked not for yourself, but for your lord, who owned the land, owned your labor, and in many ways owned you. The concept of personal freedom, as we understand it, simply didn't exist. You were bound to the land, forbidden to leave without permission, and subject to your lord's will in all matters. But even this harsh existence paled in comparison to what lay ahead when the call for crusade rang out across Europe. Pope Urban II's speech at Clermont was masterfully crafted to appeal to every segment of medieval society. To the nobles, he offered the chance for glory and the acquisition of new lands. To the merchants, he dangled the promise of new trade, routes, and untold wealth. To the peasants, he offered something even more precious: the forgiveness of all sins and guaranteed entry into paradise. The theological implications of this promise cannot be overstated. Medieval Christianity taught that most souls would spend eons in purgatory, paying for their sins before being allowed into heaven. The poor, in particular, had little hope of purchasing indulgences or making the kind of elaborate donations to the church that could reduce their time in spiritual torment. Urban's promise of instant salvation for taking the cross was revolutionary and irresistible. But Urban wasn't just appealing to spiritual motivations. He painted a picture of the Holy Land as a place flowing with milk and honey, where the soil was so fertile that crops grew without effort and where gold could be picked up from the ground. For people living on the edge of starvation, these descriptions were intoxicating. The reality, of course, would prove to be devastatingly different. When the First Crusade began in earnest in 1096, it wasn't the organized military expedition that many imagine. Before the official armies of nobles departed, a charismatic preacher named Peter the Hermit led what became known as the People's Crusade. This was a massive, unorganized migration of perhaps 100,000 people, including men, women, children, and elderly individuals who had no business attempting such a journey. People's Crusade was a disaster of almost unimaginable proportions. These weren't soldiers. They were desperate people who had sold everything they owned for a few coins to buy supplies for the journey. They had no maps, no guides, no understanding of the distances involved or the terrain they would cross. Most had never been more than a few miles from their birthplace, and suddenly they were attempting to walk from France to Jerusalem. The journey began with violence against Jewish communities across Europe. In city after city, the Crusaders turned on local Jewish populations, demanding they convert to Christianity or face death. The massacres that followed were horrific. In Mainz, nearly 1,000 Jews died. In Cologne, the entire Jewish quarter was destroyed. These weren't spontaneous outbursts of religious fervor. They were systematic campaigns of murder and pillage that revealed the true nature of crusading violence. As the People's Crusade moved eastward, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food ran out within weeks, and the Crusaders were forced to forage, steal, and beg for sustenance. Disease spread through the ranks like wildfire. Dysentery, typhus, and plague claimed thousands of lives before they even left Europe. Bodies were left unburied along the roads, creating a trail of death that stretched for hundreds of miles. When they reached Hungary, the local population, initially sympathetic to their cause, turned hostile as the Crusaders began pillaging towns and villages for supplies. What had begun as a holy pilgrimage had become an armed invasion. The Hungarian army began attacking the Crusaders, killing thousands more. Those who survived the journey through Europe faced an even more brutal reality when they reached the Byzantine Empire. Emperor Alexios I had requested Western aid against the Seljuk Turks, but he had envisioned a small professional army, not this massive horde of desperate civilians. He quickly ferried them across the Bosphorus into Asia Minor, hoping to be rid of them. In Asia Minor, the remnants of the People's Crusade met their end. The Seljuk Turks, experienced warriors who knew the terrain, surrounded and annihilated them near Nicaea. Of the estimated 100,000 who had set out from Europe, fewer than 3,000 survived. The bones of the dead were said to form a hill visible from miles away, a monument to the brutal reality of crusading warfare. But the People's Crusade was just the beginning. The official First Crusade, led by noble commanders like Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, and Raymond of Toulouse, departed in 1096 with better organization and more realistic expectations. Yet even these supposedly professional armies faced hardships that would break modern soldiers. The journey to the Holy Land took nearly 3 years and covered over 2,000 miles of hostile territory. The Crusaders had to cross mountain ranges, deserts, and enemy-held lands while carrying their weapons, supplies, and equipment. There were no supply lines, no medical support, and no possibility of retreat. Once you took the cross and began the journey, Your only options were to reach Jerusalem or die trying. Disease was the greatest killer. Medieval armies had no understanding of hygiene or sanitation, and when thousands of men were packed together, for months on end, epidemic disease was inevitable. Dysentery was so common that chroniclers barely bothered to mention it unless it killed someone important. Typhus, spread by lice, decimated entire contingents. Scurvy, caused by vitamin deficiency, left men too weak to fight even when they did reach their destination. Water was another constant problem. The Crusaders had no understanding of water purification, and they frequently drank from contaminated sources. When they found water, they often fought over it, sometimes to the death. Rivers and wells were frequently poisoned by retreating enemies, turning the most basic necessity of life into a weapon of war. Food was equally scarce and dangerous. The Crusaders were forced to eat whatever they could find: grass, bark, leather, and even human flesh when starvation became unbearable. During the siege of Ma'ara in 1098, chroniclers recorded instances of cannibalism among the Crusaders, who were so hungry they cooked and ate the bodies of their Muslim enemies. The psychological toll was enormous. Medieval people were deeply religious, and many Crusaders interpreted their sufferings as tests of faith or punishments for their sins. But as months of hardship stretched into years, many began to question whether God had truly called them to this mission. Desertion became common, with entire contingents simply abandoning the crusade and attempting to return home. Those who attempted to desert faced their own brutal fate. The roads home were controlled by hostile populations who had already been victimized by passing Crusader armies. Former Crusaders were hunted down and killed, their crosses torn from their clothing and used as evidence of their hypocrisy. Many who tried to return home died more horribly than those who pressed on to Jerusalem. The sieges were perhaps the most brutal aspect of crusading warfare. Medieval siege warfare was already horrific, but the religious nature of the Crusades added an extra dimension of savagery. When the Crusaders finally reached Antioch in 1097, they besieged the city for nearly 8 months. The defenders were equally determined, knowing that surrender meant death or slavery. During the siege of Antioch, conditions inside both the city and the Crusader camp reached depths of human misery that are difficult to comprehend. The Crusaders camped outside the walls, faced constant attacks from the garrison. They were weakened by hunger, disease, and exposure to the elements. Many were reduced to eating grass and tree bark. Some resorted to drinking their own urine to stave off dehydration. Inside Antioch, conditions were no better. The city's population, swollen with refugees, faced starvation as the siege dragged on. People ate rats, cats, dogs, and finally each other. The chronicler Matthew of Edessa described scenes of parents eating their own children to survive. When the city finally fell in June 1098, the Crusaders' pent-up fury exploded in an orgy of violence that lasted for days. The capture of Antioch revealed the true brutality of crusading warfare. The Crusaders showed no mercy to the Muslim defenders or to the city's civilian population. Men, women, and children were slaughtered indiscriminately. Houses were burned with families inside. The streets ran with blood, and the stench of corpses filled the air for weeks. But Antioch was just a preview of what was to come. When the Crusaders finally reached Jerusalem in June 1099, they faced the ultimate test of their endurance and faith. The city was heavily fortified and well defended, and the Crusaders were at the end of their strength. They had been marching and fighting for 3 years, and their numbers had been reduced by disease, battle, and desertion to perhaps 15,000 effective fighters. The siege of Jerusalem lasted 5 weeks, and it pushed both sides to the limits of human endurance. The Crusaders had no siege engines initially and were forced to assault the massive walls with ladders and grappling hooks. The defenders poured boiling oil, pitch, and molten lead on the attackers. Greek fire, a medieval incendiary weapon, turned men into living torches. The heat of the Middle Eastern summer added another layer of misery, with men collapsing from heat stroke even before they reached the walls. Water was so scarce that the Crusaders were forced to drink from cisterns contaminated with rotting corpses. Some drank their own urine mixed with wine, believing it would purify the liquid. Others chewed on leather soaked in water, trying to extract any moisture they could. When Jerusalem finally fell on July 15, 1099, the Crusaders' pent-up fury exploded in what many historians consider one of the worst massacres in medieval history. For 3 days, the Crusaders killed everyone they found in the city. Muslims, Jews, and even Eastern Christians were slaughtered without distinction. Chroniclers describe blood flowing ankle-deep in the streets and the Temple Mount covered, with corpses piled as high as a man's head. The massacre at Jerusalem wasn't an uncontrolled explosion of violence. It was systematic and deliberate. The Crusaders moved from house to house, street by street, killing methodically. They herded Jews into the main synagogue and burned it down with the people inside. They threw Muslim civilians from the tops of buildings and then stoned them to death in the streets below. Children were particular targets of the Crusaders' fury. Medieval warfare already showed little mercy to non-combatants, but the religious nature of the Crusades seemed to strip away even the minimal restraints that usually protected the innocent. Babies were torn from their mothers' arms and dashed against walls. Children were run through with swords or trampled under horses' hooves. The psychological impact on the Crusaders themselves was profound. Many had convinced themselves that they were fighting God's war, that their cause was just and their actions blessed. But the reality of what they had done in Jerusalem haunted many for the rest of their lives. Some chroniclers described Crusaders weeping as they walked through the streets they had filled with corpses, suddenly realizing the horror of what they had accomplished. Yet even after the capture of Jerusalem, the brutality of crusading life continued. The establishment of the Crusader states in the Holy Land created new forms of violence and oppression. The Crusaders were now outnumbered colonists in a hostile land, and they maintained control through systematic brutality that made their conquest look merciful by comparison. The Crusader states were essentially apartheid societies. The Muslim and Jewish populations who had survived the conquest were reduced to the status of serfs or slaves. They faced discriminatory laws, excessive taxation, and constant threat of violence. Conversion to Christianity was encouraged through a combination of incentives and threats, but even converts were never fully trusted or accepted. The Crusaders themselves lived in constant fear. They were surrounded by populations who had every reason to hate them, and they knew that any sign of weakness would lead to rebellion and massacre. Paranoia became a way of life, and the Crusaders responded to any perceived threat with overwhelming violence. The legal system in the Crusader states reflected this brutality. Punishments for even minor crimes were savage by medieval standards. Theft could result in amputation, adultery in mutilation, and treason in torture, followed by execution. The Crusaders seemed to believe that only through extreme brutality could they maintain control over their conquered territories. Daily life for the average Crusader in the Holy Land was marked by constant danger and hardship. The climate was harsh and unfamiliar, with scorching summers and unpredictable winters. Disease remained a constant threat, and the Crusaders had no immunity to local ailments that were endemic to the region. Malaria, dysentery, and various fevers killed more Crusaders than enemy action ever did. Food remained a perpetual problem. The Crusaders had to import many basic supplies from Europe, making them dependent on uncertain sea routes and unreliable supply chains. Local food sources were often contaminated or deliberately poisoned by hostile populations. The Crusaders were forced to develop elaborate food-tasting rituals and employ local Christians as intermediaries, never knowing if their next meal might be their last. The constant warfare took its own brutal toll. The Crusader states were never at peace for more than a few months at a time. Raids, skirmishes, and major battles were constant features of life. The Crusaders developed a siege mentality, retreating to fortified cities and castles at the first sign of trouble, and emerging only to launch preemptive attacks on their enemies. The castle fortresses that dotted the Crusader states were marvels of military engineering, but they were also prisons for their inhabitants. Life inside these massive stone structures was cramped, cold, and monotonous. The walls that protected the Crusaders from their enemies also isolated them from any normal human contact. Many Crusaders spent years inside these fortresses, emerging only to fight or die. The Second Crusade, launched in 1147 in response to the fall of the County of Edessa, brought new waves of European settlers to the Holy Land, but it also demonstrated that the brutality of crusading warfare was becoming, if anything, more extreme. The armies of Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany suffered even worse casualties than the First Crusade, losing perhaps 90% of their forces to disease, starvation, and enemy action. The journey of the Second Crusade was marked by atrocities that shocked even medieval chroniclers accustomed to violence. In Hungary, the Crusaders were attacked by local populations who remembered the depredations of the First Crusade. The fighting was brutal and personal, with entire villages destroyed and their populations enslaved or killed. In Asia Minor, the Seljuk Turks had learned from their experience with the First Crusade and developed new tactics specifically designed to inflict maximum suffering on the Crusaders. They poisoned wells, destroyed bridges, and launched constant hit-and-run attacks that wore down the Crusader armies without giving them a chance to fight a decisive battle. The psychological warfare employed by both sides during the Second Crusade reached new levels of sophistication and cruelty. The Turks would capture Crusaders and torture them within sight and hearing of their comrades, using their screams to demoralize the remaining forces. They would display the heads of prominent Crusaders on spears and catapult severed body parts into Crusader camps. The Crusaders responded with their own forms of psychological warfare. They would publicly execute Muslim prisoners, often by methods designed to cause maximum suffering. They would force captured Muslims to renounce their faith before killing them anyway, using religious conversion as another form of torture rather than as a genuine spiritual exercise. The role of women in the Crusades adds another dimension to the brutality of this period. While women were officially discouraged from taking the cross, many accompanied the armies as pilgrims, servants, or family members. Their fate was often worse than that of male crusaders, as they faced the additional threats of sexual violence and enslavement. Women who joined the Crusades faced unique hardships that male chroniclers barely acknowledged. They were expected to perform all the domestic labor that kept the armies functioning, while also enduring the same hardships of travel, disease, and warfare. Pregnant women gave birth on the march, often dying in the process along with their children. Children born during the Crusades faced mortality rates that approached 90%. The treatment of captured women reveals the depths of crusading brutality. Muslim women captured by the Crusaders faced rape, enslavement, or forced conversion. Christian women captured by Muslim forces faced similar fates. The concept of protecting non-combatants, already weak in medieval warfare, seemed to disappear entirely during the Crusades. The Third Crusade, launched in response to Saladin's reconquest of Jerusalem in 1187, brought together the three most powerful rulers in Europe: Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. Yet even this impressive coalition could not escape the brutal realities that defined crusading warfare. Frederick Barbarossa's death by drowning in the Salef River in 1190 demonstrates how arbitrary and sudden death could be during the Crusades. Here was the most powerful ruler in Europe, leading a massive army, yet he died ignominiously in a minor river crossing. His death demoralized his followers and led to the disintegration of the German contingent before it even reached the Holy Land. The journey of Richard and Philip by sea seemed to offer an escape from the land-based hardships that had destroyed so many previous crusades. But maritime travel brought its own forms of brutality. Ships were overcrowded, unsanitary, and vulnerable to storms and pirates. Scurvy was endemic among sailors and passengers who spent months at sea eating salted meat and hardtack. Many ships simply disappeared, their passengers and crews never seen again. The Siege of Acre, which lasted from 1189 to 1191, became a symbol of the stubborn brutality that characterized the later Crusades. Both sides were determined to fight to the death, and the siege became a war of attrition that consumed lives at an appalling rate. The Crusaders built an elaborate system of trenches and fortifications around the city, turning the siege into a permanent military camp where disease and warfare killed hundreds every week. Inside Acre, conditions were even worse. The city's population, swollen with refugees and defenders, faced starvation as the siege dragged on. People resorted to eating leather, rats, and human flesh. The dead could not be buried, and their bodies contaminated the water supply, spreading disease through the remaining population. Richard I's execution of 2,700 Muslim prisoners after the fall of Acre in 1191 shows how the brutality of the Crusades had become institutionalized. This wasn't a spontaneous massacre like Jerusalem in 1099. It was a calculated political decision made by a sophisticated ruler who understood the propaganda value of extreme violence. Richard had the prisoners killed in full view of Saladin's army, using their deaths to send a message about Christian determination and Muslim helplessness. The march from Acre to Jaffa during the Third Crusade became legendary for the discipline and endurance shown by Richard's army, but it also demonstrated the grinding brutality of crusading warfare. The Crusaders were under constant attack from Saladin's forces, who used the desert terrain to launch hit-and-run attacks while avoiding decisive battles. The heat of the Palestinian summer was almost unbearable for Europeans wearing heavy armor and carrying full equipment. Many crusaders collapsed from heat stroke and were left to die by the roadside. Water was so scarce that men paid enormous sums for a single cup, and fights over water sources sometimes resulted in more casualties than enemy attacks. The psychological pressure was enormous. The Crusaders knew they were marching through hostile territory where any misstep could mean death or capture. They could see enemy forces shadowing them from the hills, waiting for any sign of weakness. Sleep was impossible, food was contaminated, and every day brought new rumors of impending massacre. Saladin's forces showed their own forms of brutality during this campaign. They would capture stragglers and torture them within sight of the main army, using their suffering to demoralize the Crusaders. They poisoned wells and destroyed food sources, turning the entire landscape into a weapon against the invaders. The Battle of Arsuf in 1191 was one of the few decisive engagements of the Third Crusade, but even in victory, the Crusaders paid a terrible price. The battle was fought in crushing heat with no water available to either side. Men died of thirst even as they fought, and the battlefield was littered with corpses desiccated by the sun. The aftermath of Arsuf reveals another aspect of crusading: brutality, the treatment of the wounded. Medieval medicine was primitive under the best circumstances, but on campaign, injured soldiers faced almost certain death. There were no proper medical facilities, no trained surgeons, and no understanding of infection or trauma treatment. A minor wound could easily become infected and lead to agonizing death over days or weeks. The failure of the Third Crusade to recapture Jerusalem was perhaps more psychologically devastating than any military defeat. The Crusaders had endured years of hardship, had sacrificed everything they owned, and had lost thousands of comrades, only to achieve a negotiated settlement that left the Holy City in Muslim hands. Many returned to Europe, broken in spirit as well as body, unable to reconcile their suffering with their failure to achieve their ultimate goal. The Fourth Crusade, which began in 1202, represents perhaps the ultimate perversion of the crusading ideal. Instead of marching to the Holy Land, the Crusaders were diverted to Constantinople, where they sacked the greatest Christian city in the world. The brutality they displayed against fellow Christians shocked even hardened observers of medieval warfare. The financial arrangements for the Fourth Crusade demonstrate how economic factors had become as important as religious motivations. The Crusaders contracted with Venice for transportation to the Holy Land, but when they couldn't pay the agreed price, they became indentured servants to Venetian commercial interests. The Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, essentially purchased a Crusader army to serve his own political and economic agenda. The diversion to Zadar in 1202 showed how quickly crusading armies could be turned against Christian targets. The city was sacked with the same brutality that Crusaders had previously reserved for Muslim enemies. The Pope excommunicated the entire army for this attack, but the Crusaders pressed on, their religious motivations now completely subsumed by greed and political ambition. The siege of Constantinople in 1204 unleashed 3 days of destruction that ended the Byzantine Empire as a major power. The Crusaders looted churches, monasteries, and private homes with systematic thoroughness. They destroyed irreplaceable works of art, burned ancient manuscripts, and melted down sacred objects for their gold and silver content. The treatment of Constantinople's population during the sack was particularly brutal. Nobles were tortured to reveal the locations of hidden treasures. Monks were killed in their monasteries, and nuns were raped in their convents. The Crusaders seemed to take particular pleasure in defiling the symbols of Eastern Christianity, using altar cloths as horse blankets and drinking wine from sacred chalices. The psychological impact of the Fourth Crusade on both Eastern and Western Christianity was enormous. The Eastern Orthodox Church would never again trust Western crusading motives, and the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity became permanent and irreparable. In the West, many began to question whether the crusading movement had become too corrupt to represent God's will. The Children's Crusade of 1212, though probably more legend than historical fact, captures the popular imagination's understanding of how completely the crusading movement had become divorced from rational military planning. The idea that children could succeed where seasoned warriors had failed reveals the desperation and delusion that had overtaken crusading ideology. Whether or not armies of children actually marched toward the Holy Land, the stories surrounding the Children's Crusade highlight the vulnerability of the most innocent victims of crusading enthusiasm. Children were routinely exploited by crusading propagandists who promised them miraculous success while knowing they were sending them to certain death. The later Crusades continued the pattern of brutality and failure that had characterized the movement from its beginning. The Fifth Crusade, 1217-1221, ended in disaster in Egypt, with most of the Crusader army dead or captured. The Sixth Crusade, 1228-1229, achieved temporary success through negotiation rather than warfare, but this only highlighted how pointless the previous centuries of violence had been. The Seventh and Eighth Crusades, both led by Louis IX of France, demonstrated that even the most pious and well-intentioned crusaders could not escape the brutal realities of medieval warfare. Louis himself was captured during the Seventh Crusade and died of disease during the Eighth, his death symbolizing the ultimate futility of the entire crusading enterprise. The economic cost of the Crusades was staggering and added another dimension to their brutality. Entire families were bankrupted to finance crusading expeditions that often ended in death or disaster. The church imposed special taxes to fund the Crusades, impoverishing communities that were already struggling to survive. The economic disruption caused by crusading taxation and recruitment contributed to famines and social unrest throughout Europe. The social cost was equally devastating. The Crusades removed hundreds of thousands of men from European society for years at a time, disrupting agriculture, craft production, and family life. Many communities never recovered from the loss of their young men to crusading warfare. Villages were abandoned, farmland reverted to wilderness, and entire regions experienced demographic collapse. The technological innovations inspired by crusading warfare were almost exclusively focused on more efficient ways of killing and destroying. Castle architecture became more sophisticated, siege engines more powerful, and weapons more deadly. The crossbow, Greek fire, and early gunpowder weapons were all developed or refined during the crusading period, contributing to the escalating brutality of medieval warfare. The medical knowledge gained during the Crusades came at the cost of enormous human suffering. European physicians learned about anatomy by treating horrific battle wounds and learned about disease by watching epidemics decimate entire armies. The medical treatises that emerged from the crusading period read like catalogues of human misery, describing in clinical detail the various ways that human bodies could be broken, diseased, and destroyed. The psychological impact of the Crusades on European society was profound and lasting. An entire generation grew up hearing stories of holy war, religious violence, and the glorification of killing in God's name. The crusading ideal legitimized violence in ways that would influence European culture for centuries, contributing to the development of increasingly sophisticated justifications for warfare and conquest. The treatment of mental illness during the crusading period reveals another aspect of medieval brutality. Soldiers who returned from the Crusades suffering from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder were often viewed as possessed by demons or punished by God for their sins. Instead of receiving treatment, they were often subjected to exorcism, imprisonment, or execution. The impact on Jewish communities throughout Europe was catastrophic and long-lasting. The Crusades legitimized anti-Semitic violence and established precedents for the systematic persecution of Jewish populations. The massacres that began with the First Crusade continued throughout the medieval period, contributing to the development of institutionalized anti-Semitism that would plague Europe for centuries. The environmental impact of the Crusades was also significant. The massive movement of armies across Europe and the Middle East disrupted local ecosystems, while the destruction of cities and agricultural areas created environmental devastation that took generations to repair. Forests were cleared to build siege engines, fields were burned to deny them to enemies, and water sources were contaminated as weapons of war. The cultural exchange that occurred during the Crusades came at enormous human cost. While Europeans did learn about Muslim science, philosophy, and technology, this knowledge was literally paid for with blood. The libraries that were burned, the scholars who were killed, and the civilizations that were destroyed represent an incalculable loss to human knowledge and culture. The role of the Church in promoting and sustaining crusading violence reveals the dark side of medieval Christianity. Popes and bishops blessed weapons, promised spiritual rewards for killing, and developed sophisticated theological justifications for what were essentially wars of conquest and plunder. The corruption of Christian ideals by crusading ideology had lasting effects on the development of European Christianity. The treatment of prisoners during the Crusades reveals the complete breakdown of whatever limited protections existed for Non-combatants in medieval warfare. Muslims captured by Crusaders faced torture, enslavement, or execution, while Christians captured by Muslims suffered similar fates. The exchange of prisoners, common in other medieval conflicts, was rare during the Crusades because both sides viewed their enemies as fundamentally illegitimate. The logistics of crusading warfare were nightmarish and contributed significantly to the suffering of participants. Armies had to carry all their supplies across thousands of miles of hostile territory, with no possibility of resupply from home. When supplies ran out, soldiers were forced to forage, steal, or starve. The waste of human resources was staggering, with more crusaders dying from supply failures than from enemy action. The naval warfare that developed during the later Crusades added new dimensions to crusading brutality. Naval battles were particularly savage because there was no possibility of retreat or surrender. Ships were burned with their crews aboard, sailors were thrown overboard to drown, and the sea battles of the crusading period were marked by a level of viciousness that shocked even experienced warriors. The impact on Eastern Christian communities in the Holy Land was devastating and is often overlooked in traditional accounts of the Crusades. These communities, who had coexisted with Muslim rulers for centuries, found themselves caught between hostile forces, suspected by both Crusaders and Muslims of divided loyalties. Many Eastern Christian communities were destroyed entirely, their members killed or scattered. The fortification systems built during the Crusades created landscapes of perpetual warfare. The massive castles and fortified cities that dotted the Crusader states were designed for siege warfare and created a military environment where normal civilian life was impossible. Entire regions were militarized, with every structure designed for defense and every inhabitant trained for war. The development of military orders like the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller institutionalized crusading violence and created organizations dedicated exclusively to warfare in the name of religion. These orders combined monastic discipline with military efficiency, producing warriors who were trained from childhood to kill without mercy or doubt. Their influence extended far beyond the Holy Land as they became involved in European politics and warfare. The financial innovations developed to fund the Crusades had lasting impacts on European economic development. The Church developed sophisticated systems for collecting taxes, selling indulgences, and managing the estates of departed Crusaders. These financial instruments were later adapted for secular purposes and contributed to the development of more complex economic systems. The impact on Islamic society was equally devastating. The Crusades disrupted the political and economic development of the Middle East for centuries, contributing to political fragmentation and economic decline. The response to crusading invasions militarized Islamic society and contributed to the development of increasingly authoritarian political systems. The treatment of women in the Crusader states reveals another dimension of crusading brutality. Women were viewed primarily as property to be protected, exchanged, or plundered. Marriage laws in the Crusader states were designed to maintain male control over land and resources, while women who lost their male protectors faced destitution, slavery, or death. The educational impact of the Crusades was largely negative. The destruction of libraries, schools, and centers of learning throughout the Eastern Mediterranean set back intellectual development for centuries. The transfer of classical Greek and Arabic texts to Western Europe, often cited as a positive result of the Crusades, came at the cost of destroying the original centers of learning where these texts were preserved. The agricultural systems of the Holy Land were systematically disrupted by crusading warfare. Irrigation systems were destroyed, terraces were abandoned, and agricultural knowledge was lost as populations were killed or displaced. The environmental damage took centuries to repair, and some areas that were fertile during the crusading period remain barren today. The impact on trade and commerce was initially disruptive, but eventually led to the development of new commercial networks. Italian city-states, particularly Venice and Genoa, profited enormously from providing transportation and supplies to crusading armies. However, this economic development came at the cost of enormous human suffering and contributed to the increasing commercialization of warfare. The legal systems developed in the Crusader states were based on principles of conquest and racial superiority that would influence European colonial systems for centuries. The Assizes of Jerusalem and other legal codes established precedents for the systematic discrimination against indigenous populations that would be replicated in later European colonies. The artistic and architectural developments of the crusading period were marked by their military focus. Churches were built like fortresses, art depicted scenes of religious warfare, and literary works celebrated violence in the name of God. The cultural legacy of the Crusades emphasized conflict, conquest, and the glorification of war. The psychological conditioning required to turn ordinary medieval Christians into crusading warriors reveals another aspect of the movement's brutality. Priests and preachers developed sophisticated techniques for overcoming natural human reluctance to kill, using religious imagery, peer pressure, and promises of divine reward to transform farmers and craftsmen into instruments of holy war. The sermons that survive from this period are masterpieces of psychological manipulation, designed to strip away moral inhibitions and replace them with religious fanaticism. The training methods used to prepare crusaders for warfare were brutal and dehumanizing. Young men were taught to see their enemies not as fellow human beings, but as agents of Satan who deserved no mercy or compassion. Practice sessions involved mock battles where participants were encouraged to inflict real injury on their opponents, gradually accustoming them to the sight and smell of blood and the sounds of human suffering. The ritual aspects of crusading warfare added layers of psychological brutality that went beyond simple military violence. Before major battles, crusaders would participate in religious ceremonies designed to work them into a state of religious ecstasy. They would fast, pray, and flagellate themselves until they reached a state of altered consciousness where normal, moral constraints no longer applied. The aftermath of battles reveals the systematic nature of crusading brutality. After defeating enemy forces, crusaders would spend days hunting down survivors, killing wounded enemies, and desecrating the bodies of the dead. Heads were collected as trophies. Bodies were mutilated to prevent proper burial according to Islamic customs, and the battlefield was deliberately left as a monument to Christian victory and Muslim defeat. The treatment of enemy dead was particularly savage and reveals the depth of religious hatred that motivated crusading violence. Muslim corpses were fed to dogs, burned in public ceremonies, or used as projectiles in siege warfare. The symbolic violence inflicted on dead bodies was designed to terrorize surviving enemies and demonstrate the total nature of Christian victory. The impact on children born in the Crusader states was devastating and demonstrates how the brutality of the Crusades extended across generations. These children grew up in a militarized society where violence was normal and expected. They were trained from infancy to see Muslims as subhuman enemies who deserved no mercy or consideration. Many never experienced peace or normal civilian life, living their entire lives in a state of perpetual warfare. The educational system in the Crusader states was designed to perpetuate religious hatred and military preparedness. Children learned to read using texts that celebrated crusading victories and demonized Muslim enemies. Mathematics was taught using examples involving siege warfare and military logistics. Even religious instruction focused on holy war and the glorification of violence in God's name. The marriage customs in the Crusader states reflect the militarized nature of society and the brutal treatment of women. Marriages were arranged primarily for military and political purposes, with little regard for the wishes or welfare of the women involved. Young girls were married to older warriors as rewards for military service, creating a system where women were treated as spoils of war. The judicial system in the Crusader states was designed to maintain Christian supremacy through systematic brutality. Muslims and Jews faced different legal standards than Christians, with harsher punishments for the same crimes. Torture was routinely used to extract confessions, and public executions were designed to terrorize subject populations into submission. The economic exploitation of conquered territories was systematic and brutal. Muslim and Jewish populations were subjected to crushing taxation that kept them in perpetual poverty while funding further crusading expeditions. Agricultural production was reorganized to benefit Christian landowners, often leading to famine and starvation among the indigenous population. The religious policies of the Crusader states reveal the totalitarian nature of crusading ideology. Mosques were systematically destroyed or converted to churches, Islamic books were burned, and Muslim religious practices were forbidden under penalty of death. The goal was not just military conquest, but the complete eradication of Islamic culture and identity. The slave trade that developed during the Crusades added another dimension to the movement's brutality. Captured Muslims, especially women and children, were sold in European markets as exotic slaves. The Church, which officially opposed slavery, made exceptions for Muslim captives taken in holy war, creating a religious justification for human trafficking. The impact on European Jewish communities extended far beyond the initial massacres of the First Crusade. Each subsequent crusade brought renewed persecution, as Jews were blamed for everything from military defeats to natural disasters. The blood libel accusations that emerged during this period led to systematic persecution that continued for centuries. The development of anti-Islamic propaganda during the Crusades created stereotypes and prejudices that persist to this day. Islamic civilization, which was in many ways more advanced than European society, was systematically portrayed as barbaric, primitive, and evil. These characterizations served to justify crusading violence and made it easier for Europeans to dehumanize their enemies. The medical experiments conducted on prisoners during the Crusades reveal another aspect of the movement's brutality. Captured enemies were used as test subjects for new surgical techniques, poison trials, and anatomical studies. These experiments were justified as serving God's purposes, but they represented some of the earliest examples of systematic medical torture. The psychological warfare techniques developed during the Crusades were sophisticated and cruel. Both sides used captured enemies to send messages to their opponents, often by mutilating prisoners in specific ways that carried symbolic meaning. The heads of prominent enemies were displayed on spears, severed hands were catapulted into enemy camps, and psychological torture was used to break the will of both individual prisoners and entire populations. The impact on Islamic art and architecture was devastating, as crusading armies systematically destroyed cultural monuments that had taken centuries to create. Mosques, palaces, libraries, and schools were demolished not for military reasons, but to erase the physical evidence of Islamic civilization. The cultural vandalism committed during the Crusades represented an incalculable loss to human heritage. The environmental warfare techniques used during the Crusades created ecological disasters that lasted for generations. Wells were poisoned with corpses, agricultural fields were salted to prevent future cultivation, and entire forests were burned to deny shelter to enemies. The deliberate destruction of the environment as a weapon of war had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military objectives. The treatment of pilgrims during the crusading period reveals how the original stated purpose of the movement was corrupted by violence and greed. Christian pilgrims to the Holy Land faced extortion, robbery, and murder, not just from Muslim bandits, but from Crusader knights who saw them as sources of easy profit. The very people the Crusades were supposed to protect became victims of crusading Brutality. The impact on Mediterranean trade was initially disruptive, but eventually led to the development of new commercial networks controlled by Italian city-states. However, this economic development came at an enormous human cost, as traditional trade routes were disrupted by warfare and entire commercial cities were destroyed or depopulated. The development of crusading law created legal precedents that would influence European attitudes toward non-Christians for centuries. The concept of just war was expanded to justify almost any violence against non-believers, while the legal protections normally accorded to civilians were systematically stripped away when dealing with Muslim populations. The impact on European agriculture was significant, as the departure of so many young men for the Crusades disrupted farming communities and led to reduced agricultural production. Many rural areas never recovered from the demographic losses caused by crusading expeditions, leading to the abandonment of villages and the reversion of cultivated land to wilderness. The financial instruments developed to fund the Crusades had lasting impacts on European economic development, but were based on exploitation and extortion. The Church developed sophisticated techniques for extracting money from all levels of society, from wealthy nobles to impoverished peasants. These fundraising methods often pushed communities to the brink of starvation while funding military expeditions that served primarily to enrich their leaders. The technological innovations developed during the Crusades were almost exclusively focused on more efficient methods of killing and destruction. Siege engines became more powerful, fortifications more sophisticated, and weapons more deadly. The period saw rapid advancement in military technology, driven by the constant warfare and the enormous resources devoted to military purposes. The impact on European political development was profound, as the Crusades strengthened the power of the Church and established precedents for religious warfare that would influence European politics for centuries. The Pope's ability to mobilize entire armies for religious purposes demonstrated a level of political power that would be used for increasingly secular purposes in later centuries. The treatment of Eastern Orthodox Christians reveals another dimension of crusading intolerance. Despite being fellow Christians, Orthodox believers were often treated with suspicion and hostility by Western crusaders who viewed their different religious practices as heretical. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 demonstrated that religious differences, no matter how minor, could be used to justify extreme violence. The impact on Islamic scholarship was devastating, as libraries, schools, and centers of learning were systematically destroyed by crusading armies. The loss of manuscripts, scientific instruments, and accumulated knowledge represented a setback to human intellectual development that took centuries to overcome. Many texts that survived only in Arabic translations were lost forever, creating gaps in human knowledge that persist to this day. The development of military orders created new forms of institutionalized violence that combined religious fanaticism with military efficiency. The Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, and other orders became states within states, with their own armies, territories, and political agendas. Their influence extended far beyond the Holy Land, as they became involved in European banking, politics, and warfare. The treatment of converts during the Crusades reveals the superficial nature of crusading religious motivations. Muslims who converted to Christianity to save their lives were often killed anyway, while Christians who converted to Islam to escape persecution were hunted down and executed as apostates. The Crusades created an environment where religious identity was determined more by ethnicity and politics than by actual belief. The impact on European literature and culture was profound, as the Crusades provided subject matter for countless songs, stories, and poems that glorified religious warfare and demonized non-Christians. The chansons de geste and other literary works created during this period established cultural narratives about heroic Christian warriors and evil Muslim enemies that influenced European attitudes for centuries. The psychological impact on survivors of crusading violence was enormous and often led to cycles of revenge and retaliation that perpetuated the brutality. Families and communities that experienced crusading atrocities developed deep hatred for Christians that was passed down through generations, creating long-term conflicts that extended far beyond the original crusading period. The economic impact on the Islamic world was devastating, as the constant warfare disrupted trade networks that had connected Europe, Asia, and Africa for centuries. The prosperity that had characterized Islamic civilization began to decline during the crusading period, partly due to the enormous resources devoted to defense against Christian invasions. The treatment of prisoners of war during the Crusades violated even the limited protections that existed in medieval warfare. Captured enemies were routinely tortured for information, enslaved, or executed without trial. The religious nature of the conflict was used to justify the abandonment of traditional codes of military conduct, creating new standards of brutality that influenced warfare for centuries. The impact on European Jewish communities was not limited to physical violence, but included economic persecution that pushed entire communities into poverty. Jews were forbidden from most trades and professions, confined to ghettos, and subjected to special taxes that funded crusading expeditions. The economic marginalization of Jewish communities during this period had lasting effects on European society. The environmental destruction caused by crusading warfare created long-term ecological problems that affected both Europe and the Middle East. Forests were clear-cut to build siege engines and fortifications, agricultural terraces were destroyed by warfare, and irrigation systems were deliberately sabotaged as weapons of war. The environmental damage took centuries to repair and contributed to long-term economic decline in affected regions. The development of crusading ideology created intellectual frameworks that were later used to justify European colonialism and imperialism. The concept of spreading Christianity through conquest, the dehumanization of non-European peoples, and the religious justification for economic exploitation all had their origins in crusading thought and practice. The treatment of women during the Crusades reveals the intersection of religious fanaticism and gender-based violence. Women were seen as symbols of their community's honor and were specifically targeted for sexual violence as a way of humiliating enemy populations. The systematic rape of Muslim and Jewish women was not just a byproduct of warfare, but a deliberate strategy of psychological warfare. The impact on European urban development was significant, as many cities raised enormous sums to fund crusading expeditions, often bankrupting themselves in the process. The financial strain of supporting the Crusades contributed to urban unrest and political instability throughout Europe, as communities struggled to meet the Church's increasing demands for crusading taxes. The medical knowledge gained during the Crusades came at an enormous human cost, as European physicians learned about anatomy and surgery by treating the horrific wounds inflicted during religious warfare. The medical texts that emerged from this period read like catalogues of human suffering, describing in clinical detail the various ways that human bodies could be damaged by weapons and disease. The impact on Islamic art and literature was profound, as the trauma of crusading invasions influenced artistic expression for centuries. Islamic art from this period often depicts scenes of warfare and suffering, while literature focuses on themes of resistance and martyrdom. The cultural flowering that had characterized earlier Islamic civilization was replaced by a more defensive and militaristic cultural expression. The treatment of children during the Crusades reveals the complete breakdown of traditional protections for the innocent. Children were specifically targeted for violence, not just as casualties of warfare, but as symbols of their community's future. The deliberate killing of children was used as a form of psychological warfare designed to destroy enemy morale and demonstrate the totality of crusading victory. The economic exploitation of conquered territories was systematic and designed to extract maximum wealth for transfer to Europe. Agricultural production was reorganized to benefit Christian landowners. Crafts and manufacturing were monopolized by Christian merchants, and indigenous populations were reduced to a state of economic dependency that made resistance almost impossible. The impact on European monastic communities was significant, as many monasteries were forced to sell their property and treasures to fund crusading expeditions. The spiritual focus of monastic life was increasingly militarized, with monks encouraged to support holy war through prayer, fundraising, and direct participation in crusading activities. The development of crusading propaganda created new techniques for mass manipulation that would influence European politics for centuries. The Church developed sophisticated methods for using art, literature, music, and public ceremonies to promote crusading ideology and overcome popular resistance to religious warfare. These propaganda techniques were later adapted for secular, political purposes. The treatment of Islamic religious leaders reveals the systematic nature of crusading cultural destruction. Imams, scholars, and other religious figures were specifically targeted for execution or exile, as the Crusaders sought to destroy not just Islamic political power, but the intellectual and spiritual foundation of Islamic civilization. The impact on European family structure was profound, as the departure of so many men for the Crusades disrupted traditional gender roles and family relationships. Women were forced to take on new responsibilities while also facing increased vulnerability to violence and exploitation. Many families were permanently destroyed by the loss of male providers and protectors. The environmental impact of the Crusades extended beyond immediate battlefield destruction to include long-term ecological changes caused by population displacement and agricultural disruption. Entire regions were depopulated by warfare, leading to the abandonment of cultivated land and the return of wilderness areas that had been farmed for centuries. The development of new financial instruments to fund the Crusades created precedents for the systematic exploitation of European populations by their rulers. The Church's crusading taxes were so effective that secular rulers adopted similar methods for their own purposes, leading to increased taxation and economic oppression throughout Europe. The impact on Islamic science and philosophy was devastating, as centers of learning were destroyed and scholars were killed or forced into exile. The translation movement that had preserved and expanded upon classical Greek knowledge was disrupted, leading to a decline in scientific advancement that affected not just the Islamic world, but all of human civilization. The treatment of Islamic architecture reveals the symbolic importance of cultural destruction in crusading warfare. Mosques were not just converted to churches, but were often deliberately damaged or destroyed to erase the physical evidence of Islamic presence. The architectural vandalism committed during the Crusades represented an attempt to rewrite history through the destruction of cultural monuments. The psychological impact on European society was profound and lasting, as the Crusades created cultural narratives about religious warfare that influenced European attitudes toward non-Christians for centuries. The glorification of violence in God's name became embedded in European culture, contributing to later episodes of religious persecution and colonial expansion. The economic cost of the Crusades was staggering and contributed to long-term economic problems throughout Europe. Entire regions were impoverished by crusading taxes, while the wealth that was extracted from conquered territories primarily benefited a small elite of nobles and merchants. The economic inequality created by the Crusades contributed to social unrest and political instability. The impact on European legal development was significant, as crusading law created precedents for the differential treatment of Christians and non-Christians that influenced European legal systems for centuries. The concept of religious law that applied different standards to different groups became embedded in European legal tradition. The treatment of Islamic commercial networks reveals the economic motivations that increasingly drove crusading warfare. Muslim merchants were systematically excluded from trade routes, their warehouses were confiscated, and their commercial relationships were disrupted by religious violence. The destruction of Islamic commercial networks transferred enormous wealth to European merchants and contributed to the rise of Italian city-states. The impact on European agricultural development was complex, as the Crusades both disrupted traditional farming communities and introduced new crops and agricultural techniques from the Middle East. However, the human cost of this agricultural exchange was enormous, as it came through conquest and cultural destruction rather than peaceful trade and exchange. The development of crusading military technology had lasting impacts on European warfare, as the weapons and tactics developed for fighting Muslims were later turned against European enemies. The increasing sophistication and brutality of medieval warfare owed much to innovations developed during the crusading period. The treatment of Islamic literature and intellectual traditions reveals the systematic nature of cultural destruction. During the Crusades, books were burned not just as acts of vandalism, but as deliberate attempts to erase Islamic intellectual achievements and replace them with Christian alternatives. The loss of manuscripts and intellectual traditions during this period represented an incalculable loss to human knowledge. The impact on European urban culture was profound, as cities that funded crusading expeditions often experienced economic decline and social disruption. The resources devoted to religious warfare could have been used for urban development, trade, and cultural advancement, representing an enormous opportunity cost for European civilization. The psychological conditioning required to maintain crusading enthusiasm over nearly 2 centuries reveals the sophistication of medieval propaganda techniques. The Church developed methods for sustaining religious hatred across generations, using anniversary commemorations, religious festivals, and educational systems to keep crusading ideology alive, even during periods of relative peace. As we reach the end of this journey through the brutal realities of the Crusades, the sheer scope of human suffering becomes almost incomprehensible. We're not talking about statistics in a history book. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of individual human beings, men, women, and children, who experienced terror, pain, and death on a scale that challenges our understanding of human capacity for both inflicting and enduring suffering. The Crusades lasted nearly 200 years, from 1095 to 1291, but their impact on human civilization extended far beyond those dates. They established patterns of religious violence, cultural destruction, and systematic dehumanization that would influence European attitudes and policies for centuries to come. The techniques of mass manipulation, cultural erasure, and economic exploitation developed during the crusading period provided blueprints for later episodes of European expansion and colonialism. Perhaps most tragically, the brutality of the Crusades was largely pointless. The Crusader states, established through such enormous sacrifice and suffering, lasted less than 2 centuries before being reconquered by Muslim forces. The Holy Land, the supposed prize for which so many died, remained in Muslim hands. The permanent conquest of territory, the stated goal of the entire enterprise, was never achieved. What was achieved was the normalization of religious violence on an unprecedented scale. The Crusades taught European society that any level of brutality was acceptable if it was done in God's name. They established the principle that non-Christians were fundamentally different from and inferior to Christians, justifying their exploitation, enslavement, and extermination. They created cultural narratives about heroic Christian warriors and evil non-Christian enemies that would influence European attitudes toward other cultures for centuries. The economic impact was equally lasting. The Crusades accelerated the development of European capitalism by creating new financial instruments, trade networks, and commercial practices. But this economic development was built on a foundation of conquest, exploitation, and cultural destruction that established patterns of international relations based on domination rather than mutual benefit. The human cost can never be fully calculated. Conservative estimates suggest that over 1 million people died directly from crusading warfare. But this doesn't include those who died from disease, starvation, and displacement caused by the disruption of entire societies. Entire communities were destroyed, cultures were eradicated, and knowledge accumulated over centuries was lost forever. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Crusades was how ordinary people became complicit in extraordinary brutality. The men who committed the atrocities we've described weren't monsters or psychopaths. They were farmers, craftsmen, and merchants who had been convinced that their violence served a higher purpose. They returned to their homes, raised families, and lived normal lives, carrying within them the knowledge of what they had done in God's name. The Crusades reveal something fundamental about human nature and the power of ideology to transform ordinary people into instruments of destruction. They show us how religious faith, economic desperation, and social pressure can combine to overcome moral inhibitions and create conditions where any level of brutality becomes acceptable. As you sit wherever you are in the world, in whatever time zone you're watching this, remember that the capacity for both extraordinary cruelty and remarkable endurance that we've witnessed in this exploration of the Crusades exists within all human societies. The techniques of dehumanization, the justifications for violence, and the systems of exploitation that characterized the crusading period have appeared again and again throughout human history. The brutality of the Crusades wasn't an aberration or a relic of a more primitive time. It was the result of specific choices made by specific people who convinced themselves that their actions served a higher purpose. Understanding this history isn't just about learning what happened in the past. It's about recognizing the warning signs that could lead to similar brutality in our own time. The men, women, and children who suffered and died during the Crusades deserve to be remembered not as statistics or symbols, but as individual human beings whose lives had value and meaning beyond the political and religious causes that consumed them. Their suffering stands as a testament to the human capacity for endurance, even in the face of unimaginable brutality. The Crusades ended more than 700 years ago, but their legacy continues to shape our world. The religious tensions, cultural misunderstandings, and economic inequalities that they created or exacerbated continue to influence international relations. The techniques of mass manipulation and systematic dehumanization that they pioneered have been refined and employed by countless other movements and governments. Perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from the brutal realities of the Crusades is the importance of maintaining our humanity, even in the face of ideological pressure. The people who committed the worst atrocities during the crusading period didn't start as monsters. They became monsters through a gradual process of moral compromise, cultural conditioning, and ideological manipulation. Today, as you finish watching this exploration of one of history's most brutal chapters, you have a choice. You can dismiss this as ancient history, irrelevant to our modern world. Or you can recognize the eternal human struggles that these events represent and commit yourself to learning from this history rather than repeating it. The Crusades show us the worst of what humans are capable of when we allow ideology to overcome empathy, when we choose tribal loyalty over human dignity, and when we convince ourselves that our ends justify any means. But they also show us the remarkable capacity of ordinary people to endure extraordinary suffering and to maintain their humanity even in the face of systematic dehumanization. In the end, the most fitting memorial to those who suffered during the Crusades is not the romantic mythology that has grown up around these events, but an honest recognition of the brutal realities they experienced and a commitment to ensuring that such systematic brutality is never again justified in the name of God, country, or any other cause. The next time you hear someone justifying violence against innocent people in the name of religion, politics, or ideology, remember the farmers and craftsmen who became crusaders. Remember the families destroyed by religious warfare. And remember the children who died because adults convinced themselves that their cause was worth any price. The Crusades ended centuries ago, but the human capacity for both extraordinary cruelty and remarkable resilience that they revealed continues to shape our world. The choice of which aspect of human nature we choose to cultivate and express remains ours to make every single day in every interaction we have with our fellow human beings. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but necessary journey through one of history's darkest chapters. The brutality of the Crusades may be overwhelming to contemplate, but understanding this history is essential if we hope to create a world where such systematic violence becomes truly unthinkable. The victims of the Crusades, both Christian and Muslim, deserve nothing less than our commitment to learning from their suffering and working to ensure it is never repeated.